Broadly speaking, archaeological discoveries can be separated into two categories. There are things that archaeologists expect to find, and then there are things that archaeologists don't expect to find. This video is about the second category. It's all about finds that were as surprising to the people who found them as they are to everybody else. From big mysteries to little curiosities, this video has it all. The most important step in the early development of humans was learning to make tools. But almost as soon as we learned to make tools, we began to learn to make weapons. One of the earliest known weapons in the world is the so-called Thames Beater, which was found on the banks of the River Thames in London, England, several years ago. Experts say that it's around 5,530 years old, and was designed specifically as a lethal weapon. The Thames Beater is a rudimentary club, carved out of a single piece of wood, but divided into a barrel, blade, and pommel. It's the only artifact of its kind that's ever been found. Scientists have compared the design of the Thames Beater with cracks in several Neolithic-era skulls found in the same part of the world, and concluded that weapons of this kind were often responsible for the fatal injuries. It was probably wielded in much the same way we'd hold a baseball bat today. While it might be tempting to believe our Neolithic ancestors made these clubs to play an early form of baseball, they almost certainly only used them for violence. When you were growing up, you probably played the popular board game Snakes and Ladders at least once. If you have children of your own, you might even play it with them now. If so, it might surprise you to know that the game is based on an ancient Indian dice game called Gyan Chopper. It's so far proved to be impossible to trace Gyan Chopper back to its origins, but historians believe it's at least 3,000 years old, and possibly even older than that. While it's mostly played as a way of alleviating boredom today, the ancient inhabitants of India attached moral and spiritual importance to it. To them, the snake represented temptation. When you landed on a snake, you fell down the ladder of morality to arrive at a lower level of spiritual consciousness. On the other hand, if you were able to avoid temptation and arrive at the top of the board, you'd symbolically reach moksha, a state of supreme spiritual enlightenment and liberation. The game finally reached Europe in the late 19th century, but the spiritual element was lost in translation. Long before the invention of the compass, ancient mariners would traverse the seas using a mariner's astrolabe to guide them. This ancient inclinometer is an amazingly sophisticated device. It's capable of determining the latitude of any ship at sea by measuring the altitude of the sun during the day, or even the meridian altitude of the stars at night. Nobody knows for sure when the mariner's astrolabe was invented or who by. Some historians believe it was created by Raymond Lull, a 13th century Majorcan astronomer, but there's scant evidence to support that idea. 15th century German cartographer Martin Beheim is another possible candidate. By the middle of that century, the device had become almost universally popular after instructions on how to make a mariner's astrolabe were published in the Portuguese navigational textbook Arte de Navegar by Martin Cortes de Albacar in 1551. They remained in use until the end of the 17th century, when the more accurate Davis quadrant and sextant came along to replace them. There are now only 108 surviving mariner's astrolabes known to exist in the world. Cosmetics that make your skin appear whiter are hugely controversial, but they make billions of dollars every year. As controversial as they may be, they're not a new idea. In fact, they're very ancient. In March 2021, residues from skin whitening cosmetics were found inside a bronze cosmetic box in Yangqiu County, northern China. Both the box and its contents are said to be 2,700 years old. Further archaeological excavations in the area uncovered several more boxes, all of which had similar contents. The tombs they were found inside belonged to high-ranking citizens of the Shao dynasty, which might suggest that skin whitening was something that members of the social elite did to make themselves stand out from commoners. However, it's thought that only female aristocrats used them. This is another supposition, but it might be the case that women with whitened skin were thought to be more attractive. It may have been the fashion of the time. The mixture would have been harsh on the skin, with ingredients including aragonite, calcite, cinnabar, animal fat, and vegetable oil. Perhaps people have always been prepared to do uncomfortable things to themselves in the name of beauty. While we're in China, let's move to the Shanxi province and check out an unusual tomb offering. It was customary in the China of 2,000 years ago for wealthy people to be entombed with lavish grave goods like ceramics, jewelry, and weapons. But apparently, in this instance, someone thought their deceased friend or relative might get hungry in the middle of their eternal sleep. To solve the problem, they left them this enormous portion of beef. It took several months for scientists to analyze and identify the substance after recovering it from the tomb because the animal matter had long since carbonized. Now they've confirmed it to be beef. It becomes the oldest beef product ever discovered in the country. The meat was partially protected from the passing of the centuries by way of being placed inside an elaborate bronze pot. The tomb itself dates back to the Warring States period of China, some 2,300 years ago. Meat would normally shrink and rot away if left inside a tomb, but the fact that this portion retained its size suggests that it had been dried before it was placed inside the pot. Needless to say, it's no longer edible. You've all heard the story of Excalibur. It's the magical sword that King Arthur pulled out of a stone according to English folklore. In 2019, archaeologists in Majorca had a King Arthur moment of their own when they pulled this 3,200-year-old sword out of a stone near an ancient megalith on the island. The megalith is known to locals as a talayot and is one of the precious few monuments left behind by the mysterious Taliatic culture that lived on Menorca and Majorca between 3,000 and 7,000 years ago. The sword was actually found by accident. Land near the megalith was being cleared in preparation for the creation of a museum, when the sword was discovered buried beneath one rock and embedded in another. It's a remarkably well-preserved relic of the Bronze Age, and the fact that it was here to be discovered at all is particularly surprising because the area has been excavated and studied so many times before. Archaeologists believe that the sword was implanted into the rock deliberately, perhaps as a votive offering at the time the talayot was erected. Just as you've all heard the story of Excalibur, you've also all heard the tale of how former U.S. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. It happened on April 14, 1865, as Lincoln and his wife watched a play in Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. In all that time, you've probably never asked yourself, what happened to his wife's opera glasses? But we're going to tell you anyway. The opera glasses turned up in the attic of a country house in Suffolk, England in 2019. Nobody knows how they got there. They're made of ivory, and at some point in the distant past, they've been engraved to tell the story of their loss and rediscovery. According to the engraving, the binoculars were found by William Kent when he returned to the theater to find the gun that Lincoln was shot with. That's the same William Kent who rushed the president to a nearby hotel in a vain attempt to save his life. At least 2 other pairs of opera glasses said to belong to Mrs. Mary Lincoln have been sold at auction in the past, but this pair has been tested and dated to 1865, as has the inscription. That's enough for most historians to accept them as a genuine artifact. When Europeans arrived in South America hundreds of years ago, they conquered the land and destroyed many of the relics and artifacts of the original inhabitants. Because of that, huge chunks of South American history are missing. As an example, we have no idea who made these pottery fragments. They were discovered in Ecuador in 2019 and are the work of an unknown civilization that lived here 6,500 years ago. That would make them one of the oldest cultures in the Americas. Fragments have been turning up during archaeological excavations at a site known as the San Pedro Complex since 2015. But it's only more recently that scientists have been able to conclusively prove that they weren't made by a culture we're already familiar with. It was initially thought that they might be the work of the Valdivia, the creators of the oldest known pottery in the Western world. But now it seems that there may have been another civilization living alongside the Valdivia. Unfortunately, we have no idea who these people were, and we haven't yet even come up with a name for them. Hopefully, they left some other artifacts for us to find elsewhere in Ecuador. We'd love to get to know them better. The Bible tells us that when Jesus Christ was crucified, a crown of thorns was placed upon his head to mock him. Whether or not you believe that story is up to you, but some people take it very seriously. Even if such a crown existed, it's highly unlikely that it would have survived to the present day. But perhaps it did. Perhaps this crown of thorns, which was inside the world-famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France, on the day it caught fire in 2019, is the very same one that once adorned Christ's head. It was saved from the flames because it was locked away in a vault inside the cathedral. But that hasn't stopped Christians from citing the survival of the artifact as a miracle. The provenance of the crown is a controversial topic. Scientific tests have been carried out on the artifact in the past, and the results are mixed. Experts have been able to prove that it does indeed come from Jerusalem, but they think its age is closer to 1600 years than 2000. Its history is unknown prior to 1239, when King Louis IX of France brought it back to Paris after the Crusades. There's no doubt that he believed it to be the genuine article, but whether you believe it is or not is probably a question of faith. We imagine that most of you have seen the movie Shrek. If you haven't, you probably should. It's a great film. If you already know and love the characters from the movie, you'll probably find this artifact very familiar. It looks, for all the world, like a clay sculpture of the Shrek donkey character, and yet it comes from a time before movies existed. The unusual artifact was found in Chengdu, southwest China, by construction workers preparing land for the extension of a local airport. The workers had stumbled across a Han Dynasty tomb. Both the tomb and the donkey sculpture are around 2,200 years old. Given the fact that it was found inside a tomb, it was probably a funerary object of some kind, although the significance of the donkey is unknown. It might have had personal relevance to whoever was buried in the tomb. Strangely, the sculpture was beheaded before it was placed inside the tomb. The head of the donkey was found in the middle of the structure, but the body was against the back wall. Again, the act of beheading the artifact probably had a significance of some kind, but it's lost on us. We're tantalizingly close to translating the written language of the ancient Etruscans, but we're not quite there yet. When we finally solve the puzzle, we'll be able to fully understand the Tabula Cordonensis. This inscribed bronze tablet is so named because it was found in Cortona, Italy in 1992. Archaeologists believe it to be around 2,200 years old. The tablet was broken into 7 pieces when it was discovered. When experts put it back together, they realized that there should be an 8th piece, but that missing piece has never been found. Perhaps the 8th piece would be the clue that finally breaks the language barrier. This is one of the longest ancient Etruscan inscriptions ever discovered, and we've been able to translate some of the words through our limited understanding of the language. It mentions Lake Trasimeno, a vineyard, and cultivated land. Oddly, there also appear to be several references to table furnishings. It might be a written record of an ancient real estate deal, but we're not yet confident enough to state that as fact. Almost every ancient civilization in the world went through a stage of using burial masks as a funerary custom at some point. In most cases, the burial mask would cover the whole face of the deceased. Not so for the 13th and 14th century inhabitants of the Philippines. They carefully cut out very thin strips of gold to cover the mouths, noses, and eyes of their deceased loved ones, then pressed the strips into wax as an adhesive to make sure they remained in place for all eternity. It's possible, but unproven, that the Filipinos took this idea from their contemporaries in southern China. The act of covering these specific parts of the face has spiritual significance, as it was once thought that evil spirits could enter the body through openings in the face. Covering these openings meant that the deceased would never be disturbed by these malign entities. The most famous of all the Filipino death masks was discovered in Otan, Iloilo, and gave its name to the entire category of artifacts. They're now known as Otan death masks, regardless of where they're found. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.